Welcome to the Deep Dive. You're joining us today as we explore a really intriguing idea about how words actually mean what they mean. We're diving into the learnable theory of meaning from Magni, Marchetti, and El Harvey.
Right.
Now, the core of this theory is that a word's meaning isn't just some random tag we stick on things. Instead, it's deeply connected to what that word suggests we can do, the opportunities it presents for us as individuals and communities to, well, get our needs met.
Exactly. Think about it this way. The meaning of water, according to this theory, isn't just, the chemical formula HO. It's also about the affordance of quenching thirst, something fundamentally important for our survival. And what's key is that these affordances, these potential uses and benefits, are learned and understood within a social context.
Right. So for this deep dive, we're not just going to unpack the learnable theory in isolation. You shared some fascinating notes from February 4th, 2025 that touched on this whole area of meaning.
Yeah, that was interesting stuff.
And we thought it would be really valuable to see how this theory lines up with, and maybe even clashes with, the ideas of other thinkers who've grappled with the nature of meaning. Our mission today is to get a richer, more nuanced understanding of how words gain their power, uncovering some surprising links and maybe even some different ways of looking at it.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's start by really nailing down the basics of the learnable theory. What are the absolute key things we need to understand?
Okay. Well, the crucial point, like you said, is that meaning comes from these perceived affordances that relate to satisfying our needs.
Right.
And your notes highlighted a couple of important components within the theory. First, there are learnables themselves. These are essentially the mental frameworks that language helps us build,
Okay.
shaping how we see the world and the possibilities for action within it based on these affordances.
Right.
Then there's the umbra cone. Think of it like wearing, tinted glasses. Your linguistic framework makes certain affordances really clear, almost in sharp focus. But it can also subtly shade out or obscure other ways of seeing the same situation.
Interesting.
The theory also aligns strongly with functionalist views of meaning, which really emphasize that the meaning of a word is tied to how we actually use it in different contexts to achieve specific goals.
So it's not just about a static definition in a dictionary, but about what a word enables us to do.
Exactly.
And how our understanding of those enabling actions is shaped by the language we use and the learnables we've developed.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, when we think about how meaning comes into being, one author who offers a really compelling perspective is Owen Barfield. You pointed me to his essay, Poetic Diction and Legal Fiction.
Oh, yeah, Barfield.
What was it about his work that struck you as particularly relevant to this discussion?
Well, what's fascinating here is Barfield's argument that metaphor isn't just some fancy literary tool. It's absolutely fundamental to how language itself evolves and creates meaning.
Okay.
He proposes that many of the literal meanings we use every day actually originated as metaphors.
Right.
Yeah. He calls this a process of taming, where a new metaphorical understanding kind of takes hold, becomes widely accepted, and eventually becomes so ingrained in the word that we often lose sight of its figurative beginnings.
That's a powerful idea. He gives examples, doesn't he, like lives fluctuating or insight bearing fruit.
Exactly. Those are perfect examples.
We use those all the time without thinking of them as metaphors, but you can clearly see the original comparison. So how might this taming of metaphors connect with the learnable theory's focus on affordances?
Well, think about it. The original metaphor likely drew a connection between two seemingly different things by highlighting a shared affordance.
Okay.
Take insight-bearing fruit. The initial metaphorical link might have been between the affordance of a plant producing something useful, fruit,
Right.
and the affordance of understanding leading to tangible results or benefits, deeds, as Barfield mentions.
Okay.
The taming process could then be seen as the development of a new learnable, where that metaphorical meaning and its associated affordances becomes directly attached to the word itself.
I see.
Sometimes even overshadowing the original more literal meaning. It's like the affordances of the initial concept get transferred and become part of the word's new meaning over time. So the next time you use a seemingly straightforward word, it's maybe worth considering its hidden past. That insight-bearing fruit, you might say, without thinking. It's like a fossilized piece of ancient understanding about the connection between thought and outcome.
That's a really insightful way to put it. He also draws this analogy between metaphor in language and legal fiction in law. Can you break down that connection for us?
Yes, Barfield makes a really interesting comparison. He explains that legal fictions are accepted assumptions within the legal system that might technically be untrue,
Right?
but are necessary for the law to function and adapt. They introduce new understandings that allow the law to address changing social realities. He argues that metaphors work in a similar way in language. They introduce new understandings and meanings, allowing language to expand and express novel ideas. He even quotes Maitland saying that substantive law has at first the look of being gradually secreted in the interstices of procedure, which kind of mirrors how meaning can emerge and solidify over time through repeated use, much like legal precedents shape the law.
So these legal fictions, like the idea of a corporation being a person in the eyes of the law, create a new working understanding that allows the legal system to function.
Exactly.
And metaphors, similarly, create new working understandings within language. It's a fascinating parallel. Barfield also asks, regarding words with metaphorical origins like spirit, sad, or humor, are they still metaphors?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What's the significance of that question for you, the listener, particularly when we're thinking about affordances?
This question really encourages us to think about the affordances we associate with these words today compared to what their original, more concrete affordances might have been. For example, the word spirit once had a much more literal connection to breath or wind.
Right.
How have the affordances linked to spirit? Perhaps feelings of vitality, courage, or even a supernatural presence evolved and become learned over centuries, possibly becoming quite distant from that initial tangible image. It really makes you consider how deeply metaphor shapes our understanding of even our most abstract concepts.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder how many of our everyday words are carrying these hidden layers of historical affordances. Now, let's shift our focus a bit and look at the ideas of Samuel Butler, particularly his essay Thought and Language.
Butler.
His perspective on how thought and language relate seems quite interesting and might even offer a slightly different angle from the learnable theory in some aspects.
That's right. Butler argues that thinking can and does happen before and even without articulate language. He uses the example of infants,
Okay.
who clearly demonstrate understanding and reasoning, within the limits of their experience, long before they can express those thoughts in words. He even quotes someone as saying that whether ideas are expressed by eye-edge or by tongue-wedge is a detail that matters nothing.
Huh. Eye-edge.
Yeah. This raises an interesting point when we consider the learnable theory's emphasis on language as a primary tool for shaping our cognitive understanding through learnables. Could there be affordances we perceive before we have the language to fully articulate them?
So Butler seems to suggest that the underlying thought or perception comes first, and language is just one way of communicating it.
Kind of, yeah.
Not necessarily the very foundation of the thought itself, especially in its earliest stages. How does he view the nature of language itself?
Interestingly, Butler goes on to argue that if we really dig down, everything we say is metaphorical.
Everything.
He states, scratch the simplest expressions and you will find the metaphor. He even gives the examples of written words as handage, inkage, and paperage, suggesting that our labeling them as language is itself a metaphorical step removed from the physical reality of their creation.
That's a really broad and perhaps unexpected way to think about metaphor. It's like he's saying language is always at least one step removed from pure sensory experience or raw thought.
Pretty much.
Does he believe that meaning resides solely within these metaphorical words, then?
Not entirely. He believes that the profounder meaning often lies in what we read between the lines. He says, the language is not in the words, but in the heart-to-heartness of the thing, which is helped by words but is nearer and farther than they.
Heart-to-heartness.
Yeah. This suggests that for Butler, meaning extends beyond the explicit affordances that the learnable theory highlights, there's a layer of shared understanding, intention, and feeling that plays a significant role in how we make sense of what's being communicated.
That brings in a more subjective, almost intuitive aspect to meaning making. But Butler also discusses the conventional nature of language symbols, right? How does that idea fit into this?
Yes, he emphasizes that the specific symbols we use, whether we call a rock lithos, pietra, or stone, doesn't inherently matter. What's crucial is that communities reach an agreement on these symbols and consistently associate them with particular ideas. He says, the whole power of spoken language is vested in the invariableness with which certain symbols are associated with certain ideas.
Right.
This absolutely resonates with the learnable theory's idea of communities learning and agreeing upon the affordances linked to words. The stability of that association is essential for effective communication and the development of shared learnables.
So while the particular sound or shape of a word might be arbitrary, the consistent agreement within a community about what that word points to, and according to the learnable theory, what affordances it signals, is absolutely key.
Exactly.
He even briefly touches on animal communication.
Right.
How does he see that in relation to human language and meaning?
Butler argues that even animal communication possesses the essential elements of language. He points to how animals use agreed-upon signals, a growl to indicate aggression, a purr to express contentment, that are consistently linked to specific feelings or states.
Right, like a shared code.
Exactly. While undoubtedly less complex than human language, he believes it still involves a sender, a receiver, and a shared understanding of a symbol. This broadens the scope of meaning-making beyond just the satisfaction of explicit human needs, suggesting that even in simpler forms of communication, meaning arises from these shared symbolic understanding.
That's a really interesting point that challenges us to think more broadly about what constitutes meaning-making. Now, let's move on to a different perspective on meaning with W.B. Galli and his concept of essentially contested concepts.
Yes, Gally, this is fascinating stuff.
What are these, and how might the learnable theory help us understand them?
Okay, so essentially contested concepts, according to Gally, are ideas that are the subject of ongoing, seemingly never-ending disagreements about how they should be properly understood and applied.
Like what?
Think about concepts like democracy, art, or maybe social justice.
Okay, yeah, those definitely spark debate.
Right. He identifies several key characteristics of these concepts. We generally value them highly. They have a complex internal structure with multiple facets. They can be described in various legitimate ways. They often have an original, widely admired example that serves as a kind of touchstone. And discussions around them tend to be both assertive, arguing for one's own interpretation, and defensive, criticizing alternative interpretations.
So there's this inherent element to disagreement built right into the core of these concepts. How might the learnable theory, with its emphasis on affordances and the satisfaction of human needs, help us understand why this persistent contestation exists?
Well, it's quite possible that these differing interpretations arise from different groups or individuals prioritizing different affordances or having different needs that they believe the concept should satisfy.
Okay.
For example, what one group sees as the essential affordances of a democratic system in fulfilling their needs for, say, representation and individual liberties might be quite different from another group's focus on the affordances related to social equality or economic justice.
Right, different priorities.
Exactly. The original exemplar that Gally mentions could be seen as representing an initial set of perceived affordances that different groups then emphasize or interpret in light of their own evolving needs and social contexts, leading to these continuous debates about the concept's true meaning, recognizing that democracy or justice are battlegrounds of meaning, isn't about giving up on them. It's about understanding that engaging with these ideas requires acknowledging different valid perspectives on the core values at play.
So the core idea might have some shared initial affordances, but as different groups try to realize those affordances in different ways to meet their specific needs, the very meaning of the concept becomes a site of ongoing contest.
Precisely.
Galli also suggests that recognizing a concept as essentially contested can actually improve the quality of discussions around it. How does that work?
He argues that acknowledging that a concept is essentially contested forces us to recognize the potential validity in rival interpretations, even those we strongly disagree with. He states that it has permanent potential critical value to one's own use or interpretation of the concept in question.
Okay.
By trying to understand why others interpret the concept differently and what needs or affordances they are prioritizing in their understanding, we can refine our own perspective and construct more robust arguments, rather than simply dismissing opposing views as inherently wrong.
It's about fostering a more nuanced and self-aware way of engaging with these really complex and important ideas. Now let's turn our attention to Aldous Huxley and his essay, Words and Their Meanings.
Huxley, always sharp.
He seems particularly concerned with the immense power of words and how they can shape our thoughts and actions, sometimes in ways that can be quite problematic.
Absolutely. Huxley emphasizes the profound influence of words on our thoughts, feelings, and ultimately our behavior. He categorizes words into those that refer to concrete objects or qualities, those that refer to less definite things like abstract ideas or psychological states, and words that are primarily designed to evoke emotions. His main concern lies with the second and third categories, where the meaning can become much more fluid and susceptible to manipulation.
Right. He specifically warns us about the human tendency to objectify abstract concepts, like society with a capital S, right? What are the potential dangers of doing that?
Yes. Huxley points out our tendency to treat abstract concepts as if they were tangible, unified entities with their own intentions and feelings, when in reality they often represent diverse and complex collections of individuals or phenomena. He uses the example of Clerk Maxwell's intellectual error, where Maxwell inadvertently personified science as a cautionary tale about accepting language without critical analysis. Huxley writes that Maxwell had accepted the English language without question or analysis as a fish accepts the water it lives in. Think about how often we hear terms like the economy or public opinion thrown around as if they are single unified entities. Huxley's point makes you wonder if we're sometimes being misled by the very language we use to discuss these complex issues, in your own work or when you're reading the news.
So, by treating society as a single entity with its own will, we might overlook the diverse and often conflicting needs and affordances of the individuals who make up that society.
Exactly.
How does this relate back to the learnable theory's idea of accepting language without question?
It suggests that if we accept language and the learnables embedded within it without critical examination, we risk developing a simplified or even distorted understanding of reality and the underlying affordances.
Okay.
Just as Maxwell's unquestioning acceptance of the personified science led him to an error, our uncritical use of abstract terms like society might obscure the fundamental complexities and prevent us from truly understanding the diverse needs and affordances at play within that group.
That makes perfect sense. Huxley also touches on the fact that many intellectual errors have emotional or even deliberate origins, pointing to things like propaganda.
Right.
How do our feelings and intentions influence the meaning we ascribe to words?
Huxley argues that we often make intellectual mistakes because it serves our emotional needs or aligns with our pre-existing beliefs to do so. In the case of propaganda, for instance, highly charged language is used specifically to stir up strong emotions and manipulate people's understanding and actions.
Right.
This highlights that our perceived needs and desires for belonging, for security, for a particular political outcome can significantly influence the meaning we are willing to accept or assign to certain words, even if that meaning isn't based on a rational assessment of the underlying affordances or realities.
It's like our needs can actively shape the learnables we embrace, sometimes even overriding a more objective evaluation. Now let's come back to the learnable theory itself, drawing from the Learnable Linguistics for Business Leaders piece.
Okay, back to the core theory.
What key aspects did you want to revisit in light of these other perspectives we've discussed?
This piece really underscores the dynamic relationship between how we learn and the language we use, and how the learnables embedded in our language can both broaden and restrict our thinking.
Right.
It emphasizes how language can perpetuate biases, stereotypes, and cultural norms, which in turn can limit our understanding of the world and, crucially, our awareness of different affordances.
They provide some specific examples of these language schemes that can limit our thinking, right?
Yeah.
Things like the either-or fallacy, generalizations, euphemisms, and loaded language.
Exactly.
How do these relate to the idea of affordances?
Well, each of these linguistic schemes can effectively distort or hide the perception of available affordances. The either-or fallacy presents a situation as having only two possible outcomes.
Black and white thinking.
Yeah, potentially blinding us to other options and their associated affordances. Generalizations and stereotypes lead us to make broad assumptions about entire groups, preventing us from recognizing the unique affordances of individuals within those groups. Euphemisms and doublespeak are used to deliberately obscure the true nature of something, thereby concealing its real affordances and consequences. And loaded language and emotional appeals manipulate our feelings, potentially leading us to perceive affordances based on emotional response rather than a rational evaluation.
So these language schemes act like filters that can either highlight certain potential avenues for need satisfaction while simultaneously obscuring others.
Precisely.
The learnable theory piece also delves into the power of different types of words, nouns, adjectives, verbs, in shaping how we see the world.
Yes, it explores how nouns, by identifying entities and ascribing intersubjectively understood affordances, can be particularly influential in shaping our sense of identity and our behavior. The study they mentioned, showing that children labeled as helpers were more likely to offer assistance, beautifully illustrates this. Using the noun helper activated a specific set of perceived affordances associated with that role.
That's a powerful example of how a simple label can influence behavior by highlighting certain affordances. What about adjectives and verbs? What role do they play in shaping our perception?
Adjectives, in contrast to the broader scope of nouns, select only a specific, limited set of affordances of an entity, effectively focusing our attention on particular characteristics.
Okay.
This can be a powerful tool for directing attention or conveying more abstract information.
Right.
Verbs, and even grammatical structures like the passive voice, can foreground different aspects of an action, the abilities of the agent performing the action versus the affordances of the object being acted upon.
Subtle but important.
Yeah. Even modal verbs like could versus should can subtly influence our perception of possibilities and obligations, impacting our divergent thinking, as some studies suggest.
So the very grammar we use and the specific words we choose can subtly shift our focus and influence how we understand the range of affordances that might be present in a situation.
Absolutely.
The Learnable theory piece also introduces the concepts of lexical discrepancies and grammatical discontinuities as ways in which new learnables can emerge. What are some examples of these?
Okay, so lexical discrepancies include the creation of new words, neologisms.
Like podcast. Or the gaming term noob. And also the expansion of existing words to take on new meanings, semantic extensions, like how the word mouse came to refer to a computer peripheral. Grammatical discontinuities involve using language in unexpected ways, such as an adjective being applied in an unusual context or a modal verb being used independently. These deviations from typical language use can force us to make new cognitive connections and recognize new affordances.
It's like language has this built-in flexibility to adapt and describe new realities and new ways of understanding the world. They also discuss how major events and innovations can lead to the revision of our existing learnables. Yeah.
Using examples like the COVID-19 pandemic and the concept of being alone together.
Exactly. The pandemic compelled us to redefine what togetherness means, leading to the development of new learnables around connection and community in the absence of physical proximity. Similarly, innovations like the vertical forest or the smartphone combine existing words in novel ways, prompting us to understand entirely new sets of affordances and functionalities associated with these new concepts.
And they even touch on the idea of learnable development through paradox, where combining seemingly contradictory terms can lead to new insights. Human resources and industrial park were given as examples.
Yes, these paradoxical terms force us to reconcile what appear to be opposing ideas, often leading to a more nuanced understanding.
Oh, so.
While human resources highlights the inherent tension between valuing individuals and managing them as assets within an organization, industrial park combines the concepts of industry and nature, creating a specific kind of designated space. These paradoxes can spark new ways of thinking about the underlying affordances and relationships.
The piece also briefly mentions how language can be used to explore the unknown, even referencing Alberto Moravia's Letter del Sahara. How does language facilitate that kind of exploration?
The learnable theory suggests that language, through the use of comparisons and rhetorical devices like anti-metabole, where phrases are repeated in reverse order, can help us understand what is unfamiliar by relating it to the learnables we already possess. Moravia's descriptions of the tracks in the Sahara by comparing them to familiar Western roads illustrate this point. He uses his existing understanding of the affordances and limitations of a road to begin to grasp the affordances and limitations of the Saharan piste.
So language acts as a kind of bridge, allowing us to use our existing knowledge and learnables to begin to make sense of things we haven't encountered before. Now, let's consider Bronislaw Malinowski's perspective on language and magic. How does his view relate to the learnable theory, particularly concerning how children first acquire language?
Malinowski points to what he calls the quasi-magical influence of a child's early language use.
Quasi-magical?
Yeah. When a young child utters a word and their needs are subsequently met, for example, saying milk and receiving milk, it creates a very powerful initial connection between words and their ability to directly influence the environment and satisfy basic needs.
Oh.
This aligns perfectly with the Learnable theory's emphasis on need satisfaction as a foundational element in the development of meaning.
It's like the very first affordances we learn about language are directly tied to getting our fundamental needs met.
Precisely.
He also discusses magical spells. How does he see their function in relation to meaning and affordances within a community?
Malinowski argues that while magical spells might appear to be directed at specific objects or spirits, their primary impact is often on the magician, their immediate group, and the broader social structure.
So not necessarily affecting the thing itself.
Not directly, maybe. The shared belief in the spell's efficacy can reinforce social cooperation, provide a sense of control in uncertain situations, and establish frameworks for action, particularly in activities like agriculture or fishing.
Okay.
So the meaning of the spell isn't just in the literal words themselves, but in the social affordances it creates, fostering belief, cooperation, and a shared sense of purpose within the community.
So even in the context of magic, language plays a role in creating social affordances and strengthening community bonds. Moving to a very different social context, A.S. Ross's You and Non-You
You and non-you, classic.
explores how specific social groups use language to signal belonging and distinction. How does this relate to the learnable theory?
Ross's work provides a really clear illustration of how language choices can create and maintain social affordances. By consistently using certain words, like looking glass, and deliberately avoiding others, like mirror, the upper class, the you group in British society, historically signaled their social status and reinforced their group identity.
Right.
This demonstrates how meaning can be deeply tied to the fundamental social needs of belonging and distinguishing oneself, and how specific linguistic choices act as markers of these social affordances.
It's like these particular word choices offer the affordance of social acceptance within a specific group, while simultaneously creating a subtle barrier for those who don't use that vocabulary.
Exactly. It's all about signaling.
Now let's delve into Gilbert Ryle's arguments in his essay, The Theory of Meaning. He offers a critique of a purely denotative theory of meaning. What does that mean, and what's his proposed alternative?
Okay, so Ryle argues against the idea that the meaning of a word is simply the object or concept it names or denotes.
The pointing theory of meaning.
Yeah, basically. He points out that sentences aren't just collections of labels, and the meaning of a sentence can't be reduced to just the things its individual words refer to. He famously states, "What a sentence means is not decomposable into the set of things which the words in it stand for, if they do stand for things."
So for Ryle, meaning is about more than just pointing to things. What does he suggest is the basis of meaning then?
Ryle proposes a functionalist view, suggesting that the meaning of a word lies in its role, its use, within the broader context of language.
Okay.
He uses a helpful analogy. Think of a tennis racket. Its significance isn't just in its physical form, but in the kinds of strokes it allows you to make.
Right.
Similarly, a word's meaning is found in how it functions within actual and possible sentences. He emphasizes that learning the meaning of an expression is more akin to learning a skill or an operation than simply encountering a new object.
So if I'm understanding correctly, Ryle is saying that the meaning of chair isn't just the object itself, but everything we can do with the word chair and how we talk about those actions, like its job in the sentence.
Exactly. It's about the whole range of its uses in our language, the role it plays.
Gotcha. Finally, let's turn to Friedrich Waismann's perspective in The Resources of Language. He discusses the dynamic and sometimes even insufficient nature of language.
Yeah, Waismann has some really interesting points here. He cautions against being too rigid in our understanding of ordinary language use, arguing that language is constantly evolving
Right.
and needs to stretch and adapt to accommodate new situations and ideas. He provides vivid examples of how language goes beyond its established norms to describe novel phenomena, such as flicker across a disk or a voice coming from behind darkness. He writes, "Notice with what unerring instinct language contrives to say, at the cost of a slight departure, what would be unsayable if we moved along the rigid grooves of speech." It's like language finds a way, even if it has to bend the rules a bit.
So language isn't always perfectly precise or adequate for every situation, but it has this remarkable capacity to adapt and express new ideas by bending or even breaking its own established rules.
Exactly.
How does this connect with the learnable theory's idea of our learnables evolving over time?
Waismann's perspective really highlights the mechanisms through which new learnables can emerge. By creatively flouting established linguistic norms, by using words in unexpected or novel ways, Language creates openings for new meanings and new understandings of affordances to arise.
Okay.
It's in these moments of linguistic innovation, when language stretches beyond its usual boundaries, that our understanding of the world and the learnables that shape that understanding can truly evolve and expand.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive, bringing together so many different and insightful perspectives on the nature of meaning.
Yeah, it's a rich topic.
To quickly recap some key points, we heard Barfield argue that metaphor is the living core of how language grows.
The taming process.
Butler suggesting that meaning extends beyond just words to encompass shared understanding and intention, that heart-to-heartness.
Right.
Galley highlighting that some of our most important concepts are inherently contested.
Like democracy or art.
Huxley warning us about the powerful and sometimes misleading influence of the words we use, especially abstract ones.
The fish and water idea.
And the learnable theory grounding meaning in the affordances we perceive in relation to our needs.
The core framework we started with.
We also touched on Malinowski's view of the social and even magical power of early language.
That initial needs-based connection.
Ross's examples of how social groups construct meaning through language, the you and non-you signaling.
Social affordances.
Ryle's emphasis on meaning as use and function rather than just naming.
Meaning as a skill.
And Weisman's insights into the fluid and ever-evolving nature of language.
Language stretching itself, exactly. Well, the learnable theory provides a really valuable framework by connecting meaning to our fundamental human needs and the affordances we perceive, and by showing how language shapes our cognitive landscape. It's clear that the creation and interpretation of meaning is a much more complex and multifaceted process. Considering these other perspectives really enriches our understanding of how language operates in our lives, how it changes over time, and ultimately how it shapes our interaction with the world around us.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. Consider a common word that you use every single day. What are the core affordances that word triggers for you? How might those very same affordances be perceived differently by someone from a different cultural background or with different life experiences?
Good question.
And how has the meaning of that word and the affordances you associate with it potentially shifted and evolved over time, even within your own lifetime? It's a powerful reminder that the words we use are not static labels, but rather dynamic tools that are constantly being shaped by our individual needs, our shared experiences, and the ever-evolving communities we are a part of. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.